What happens when a ruthless gang targets a quiet doctor, only to discover he's a former combat medic? Watch as Dr. Ethan Westbrook, with his allies EZ and Naya, fights back against the Raven Syndicate and uncovers a dark secret threatening their community. In the heart of the city, under the weight of its crumbling infrastructure, the Raven Syndicate ruled the streets. For years, they had been the unchallenged power, controlling entire neighborhoods with an iron fist. Their reach extended far beyond just drug dealing or petty theft. They had their hands in businesses, construction, and anything that could bring in money. Fear was their weapon. People paid their dues, not because they wanted to, but because they knew what happened if they didn't. The police were too scared to interfere, and the community was too intimidated to resist. The syndicate believed that no one would ever dare to stand up to them. They were wrong. The Sierra Health Clinic was a small, modest place in the middle of a rough neighborhood. Tucked between a rundown convenience store and a dimly lit diner, the clinic didn't stand out. The building was old, the floors scuffed from years of use. The waiting room had mismatched chairs, a few magazines, and the faint scent of antiseptic. It was the kind of place where people came to seek help, to heal, but they didn't expect miracles. Dr. Ethan Westbrook, the clinic's founder, was a man in his 40s, worn by the years of exhaustion that came with running a small practice. His eyes often carried the weight of his work. Too many patients, too few resources. But he had chosen this life, to help people, even when it meant sacrificing his own well-being. Most people assumed he was just another overworked doctor, a quiet man who didn't get involved with anything outside his clinic. The Raven Syndicate thought the same. They saw Dr. Westbrook as an easy target, just another business to extort. After all, who would want to risk their life over a small clinic that was barely hanging on? They couldn't have been more wrong. Before the white coat and stethoscope, before the long nights stitching up gunshot wounds, Dr. Westbrook had been a combat medic. He had seen the worst of humanity, on the front lines of war zones where every decision, every hesitation could mean life or death. He had been trained to survive in the most dangerous environments. His hands, steady from years of medical practice, had also saved lives in the most harrowing conditions, under fire, surrounded by chaos. That man, the soldier, had never really left. And now, standing behind the counter of his clinic, facing the 5 men who had walked through the door, he was reminded of the instinct to fight that he had buried for so many years. The syndicate had expected the usual. They sent their muscle, Rico, the leader, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, and his crew of tough guys. They strolled into the clinic, their boots heavy on the worn floors, their voices rough as they issued orders. Rico had an air of superiority about him, a man who didn't expect resistance from anyone. After all, he had seen enough small businesses cower before him to know how this was going to go. They had walked in expecting to walk out with whatever they wanted. But Dr. Westbrook was different. "Doc," Rico said, his voice low but carrying an edge, "we're gonna need you to set aside some supplies. Antibiotics, bandages, anything we need. You're gonna treat us first, no questions, no charge. Understand?" Dr. Westbrook didn't answer right away. He didn't look up, continuing to work on the patient in front of him, an elderly man with a torn sleeve. His movements were steady and deliberate. He was calculating, his mind already working, assessing the situation. He had been in far worse situations. He knew that this wasn't just a robbery, it was an intimidation tactic, and it was one he wasn't willing to comply with. Naya, the clinic's head nurse, had been standing nearby. She'd seen Dr. Westbrook handle difficult situations before, but never anything like this. Her eyes flicked to the 5 men standing by the door, their guns holstered, but their bodies tense. She could see the unease in their eyes, the shift in the atmosphere that told her this was no ordinary moment. "I'll treat anyone who's hurt," Dr. Westbrook said finally, his voice calm but firm. "But I'm not handing over my supplies. If you want something from here, you'll have to pay for it, like everyone else." Rico's face twisted into a sneer. He took a step forward, closing the gap between himself and Dr. Westbrook. "You don't get to make demands here, Doc. We're not asking for your permission." But Dr. Westbrook didn't flinch. He didn't move. His eyes met Rico's, and there was something in his gaze that made the air grow colder. Rico stepped back, just a little, caught off guard by the doctor's calmness. Before he could say anything else, Nia spoke up, her voice unwavering. "You don't want to do this. Leave now, before this turns into something you'll regret." For a moment, there was silence. The tension in the room thickened, palpable, as if the entire clinic was holding its breath. Rico looked over at his men, then back at Dr. Westbrook. The moment seemed to stretch on forever. Then it happened. Rico moved first, quick as a snake, and before anyone could react, he swung at Dr. Westbrook with a brutal left hook. But Dr. Westbrook was faster. With a swift motion, he ducked under Rico's punch and in one fluid movement, grabbed the man by the wrist, twisting it and sending him crashing into the counter. The force of the impact knocked the air out of Rico, and he stumbled back, momentarily stunned. His crew took a step back, surprised by the doctor's sudden strength. "That was a mistake," Dr. Westbrook said, his voice cold but steady. He was no longer just the doctor. He was the soldier, the fighter, the man who had fought to keep others alive when the world was burning around him. Nia watched in awe as the battle unfolded. She had worked with Dr. Westbrook for years, but she had never seen him move like this. Fast, precise, lethal. The tension in the clinic exploded as the rest of Rico's men rushed in, guns drawn. But Dr. Westbrook was already ahead of them. With the speed of someone who had faced real danger, he moved through the room like a shadow. A punch here, a twist there. One man was disarmed and knocked unconscious. Another was sent sprawling to the floor, gasping for air. The clinic, once a place of calm and healing, had become a battleground. As Rico struggled to get to his feet, his face contorted with fury. He realized this was not going the way he had planned. "You think you can stop us, Doc?" he growled, wiping blood from his mouth. Dr. Westbrook stood tall, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. "Some men don't break," he said quietly, locking eyes with Rico. "And some places won't fall." The words hung in the air, as if to reinforce the new reality in the room. The Raven Syndicate had underestimated him, and now they were going to pay the price. The room was silent for a moment, the echoes of the chaos still hanging in the air. Rico, now visibly shaken and nursing a bruised jaw, stood up slowly, his gaze never leaving Dr. Westbrook. His men were struggling to recover, each nursing wounds that had come from underestimating the man they had come to intimidate. But Dr. Westbrook wasn't finished. He was in control now, and he wasn't about to let this intrusion go unchallenged. Rico wiped the blood from his lips, his eyes narrowing with growing anger. "You think this ends here, Doc?" he sneered, the words laced with venom. "You're a fool if you think this is over. You just made a huge mistake." Dr. Westbrook didn't react. He simply stood there, arms at his sides, his face calm but stern. His eyes flicked briefly to Nia, who stood near the counter, her fingers still clutching her clipboard, though her knuckles were white with the force of her grip. She had seen Dr. Westbrook in action before, but never like this. He wasn't just protecting his clinic anymore. He was protecting everyone inside it, from himself to his patients. The sound of footsteps from the back of the clinic broke the silence, and a man entered, a civilian who had been waiting for a checkup. His face went pale as he saw the scene unfolding, and he instinctively took a step back toward the door, his hand trembling. Dr. Westbrook turned to him quickly, his calm demeanor never faltering. "It's okay, Mr. Mendez," he said in a reassuring tone. "Just stay where you are. We'll be done here in a minute." But it wasn't a minute. Rico barked an order to his men, his tone snapping with impatience. "Get him!" he ordered, pointing toward Dr. Westbrook, who had just turned back to his patients. Two of his men moved in with swift precision, their eyes locked on the doctor, their weapons drawn. They had underestimated him before, and they were about to do so again. As one of them lunged toward Dr. Westbrook, the doctor sidestepped, his movement swift and precise, like a man who had danced this dance before. He grabbed the man's wrist in one smooth motion, twisting it behind his back and forcing him to the ground with a sickening thud. The second man hesitated for a fraction of a second, but that hesitation was enough. In that split second, Dr. Westbrook was already moving again. A kick to the man's knee sent him crumpling to the ground with a painful cry. His weapon skittered across the floor, landing just out of reach. Dr. Westbrook didn't hesitate. He closed the distance, grabbed the man by the collar, and shoved him into a row of metal filing cabinets, knocking him out cold. Nia stepped forward now, her voice louder and more insistent. "Get out!" she shouted, her eyes flashing with the same resolve that had always made her a formidable ally to Dr. Westbrook. "You've got no business here." But Rico was not about to back down. He had been humiliated, and humiliation was something he wasn't willing to take lying down. His crew had already taken a beating, but they were recovering, and Rico wasn't going to let this doctor's small victory go unpunished. "Think you can beat us?" Rico growled, his hand reaching into his jacket for something. "You've made your last mistake, Doc." Dr. Westbrook's gaze never wavered, his body still calm and poised despite the chaos around him. But his instincts were on high alert. He had seen the way Rico's hand moved, the subtle shift in his posture that signaled what was coming next. Dr. Westbrook knew that whatever weapon Rico had just grabbed would be used to escalate the violence. He didn't wait for it to come. The moment Rico pulled the gun, Dr. Westbrook was already in motion. He dove forward, grabbing the barrel and twisting it away from his body. The gunshot rang out, its deafening crack echoing through the small room. A bullet ricocheted off the clinic's walls, the sharp ping of metal against concrete filling the air. For a brief moment, everything was frozen. The men who had rushed in were now frozen in disbelief. The shot had missed, but the tension in the room was palpable, thick and suffocating. The civilian patient, still standing by the door, had dropped to the floor in fear, hands covering his head, trying to shield himself from the violence. Rico's face twisted with rage as he tried to regain control, but Dr. Westbrook wasn't about to give him the chance. In one fluid motion, he kicked the gun from Rico's hand, sending it skittering across the floor. He then grabbed the back of Rico's neck, slamming his head into the reception desk with a brutal thud. Rico's body went limp as he crumpled to the floor. For a moment, the room was silent again, save for the sounds of Rico's labored breathing. The other members of his crew, their faces filled with disbelief, took hesitant steps backward. Dr. Westbrook straightened, wiping the blood from his hands onto his coat sleeve. His expression was unreadable. The room was a mess, chairs knocked over, a few broken windows from the gunshot, the remnants of the fight scattered across the floor, but the clinic was still standing. "Leave," Dr. Westbrook said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had already been through far worse. "Take your men and go." Rico, bloodied and beaten, could barely keep his eyes open. He tried to push himself to his feet, but it was clear he didn't have the strength. He looked at Dr. Westbrook for a long moment, his chest heaving with heavy breaths. "You really think you've won?" Rico spat, his voice hoarse. "You've only made things worse for yourself." Dr. Westbrook didn't respond. Instead, he turned and motioned for Nia to help him secure the remaining supplies that had been knocked over during the fight. She didn't hesitate. There was no time to waste on words now. The clinic needed to be restored, and the threat of what would come next lingered in the air. The members of the Raven Syndicate, humiliated and beaten, finally retreated. One by one, they shuffled out of the clinic, leaving behind a trail of chaos and violence. The door slammed shut behind them, and for a moment, the clinic was still. The adrenaline in Dr. Westbrook's body began to settle, but the weight of what had just happened still hung heavy in the air. Nia exhaled, her hands trembling slightly. She glanced over at Dr. Westbrook. "What now?" Dr. Westbrook looked out the window, his expression thoughtful. The streets outside were quiet, but he knew the calm wouldn't last. The Raven Syndicate didn't take defeat lightly. The quiet that had followed the fight was the calm before the storm. "We prepare," he said simply. The aftermath of the skirmish left the clinic in disarray. The broken windows were quickly boarded up, and the few patients who had been there earlier had long since left. The dim light of the late afternoon filtered through the cracked blinds, casting long shadows across the floors. The clinic, usually a place of healing, felt heavy, like a battlefield that had yet to fully settle. Dr. Westbrook stood near the front desk, his hands still steady despite the adrenaline that had run through him only moments ago. His eyes remained calm, his breath measured, but underneath it all, a familiar weight pressed against his chest, a weight that had been there for years, hidden beneath layers of routine. The fight had been a reminder of what he had left behind. The violence, the chaos, the constant struggle for survival. It was a part of him, one that he had buried when he hung up his military uniform and put on the white coat of a doctor. Nia stood across the room, organizing the scattered medical supplies, her movements quick but deliberate. She hadn't spoken much since the fight ended, but she didn't need to. They both understood the gravity of the situation. The Raven Syndicate wouldn't just leave them alone. This had only been the beginning. "Doc, you sure you're all right?" Nia asked, her voice breaking the silence. She had seen Dr. Westbrook face danger before, but never like this. There had been close calls, fights, threats, tense moments, but nothing like this. He had fought back with a level of precision that surprised even her. Dr. Westbrook didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked over the mess in the clinic, his gaze distant, his mind already working through the next steps. He had always been like this, even during the most difficult of surgeries, focused, calculating, always moving forward. But there was a heaviness in his posture now, something that went beyond the physical exhaustion. It was the weight of the past, something that had been buried long ago, but now resurfaced with the violence of the last few hours. "I'm fine," he replied finally, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. "Just a little shaken up. Nothing I haven't been through before." Nia raised an eyebrow at him, clearly not buying it. She had worked alongside him for years, and she knew better than anyone that there was more to Dr. Westbrook than what he let on. He had always been the kind of man who kept his past locked away, who never spoke about the things he had done before opening this clinic. But now it was becoming harder to ignore the truth. She crossed the room and stood beside him, her arms crossed. "It's not just about the fight, is it?" she asked softly, knowing that she was treading on dangerous ground. "Something's off. You're acting like this is all too familiar." Dr. Westbrook stiffened at her words, his jaw tightening. He turned away from her, his eyes lingering on the wreckage that remained. The broken windows, the overturned chairs, everything was a reminder of what had just happened. But Nia's words stung deeper than any physical wound. She was right. This wasn't just another street fight to him. This was something much darker. "You don't need to worry about me, Nia," he said, his voice low. "I've been through worse." Nia watched him closely. She could see the way his hands clenched at his sides, the way his body tensed with something he wasn't saying. It wasn't like him to keep things buried for so long, and whatever it was starting to come to the surface. "You're not fooling anyone," she said, her tone sharp. "This isn't just some old army memory you're trying to brush off. Something's different now. And if we're going to deal with these guys, we need to know what we're up against." Dr. Westbrook took a deep breath and finally turned to face her. The years of restraint were written in the lines of his face, in the exhaustion in his eyes. He had tried to leave that life behind, the life where every day was a fight for survival. But it had followed him here, to this small clinic, to this quiet neighborhood, and now it was threatening to tear it all apart. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice heavy. "This isn't just another robbery. This is something personal." Nia's brow furrowed. "Personal?" Dr. Westbrook nodded, his eyes distant, as if he was seeing something from long ago. "Before I was a doctor, I was a combat medic. I spent years in war zones, places where every day was a fight for survival. I've treated wounds under fire, patched up soldiers who didn't make it, and lived in conditions that, well, I'd rather not remember." His eyes met Nia's, his gaze steady. "But those years, those experiences, they never really leave you." Nia stared at him, processing what he was saying. She had known he had been in the military, but the details had always been vague. He had never shared much about it. It was clear now that there was more to him than the quiet, reserved doctor who ran this small clinic. "That's why you were able to fight back so fast," she said softly. "You've been through it before." Dr. Westbrook nodded. "I've seen worse. I've been in places where life and death were separated by the smallest of margins. It's a different world, a brutal world, and when it comes down to it, you either adapt or you die." Nia didn't say anything for a long moment. She had always known Dr. Westbrook had an edge to him, something that set him apart from the other doctors she had worked with. But hearing the weight of his past brought it all into focus. This wasn't just some former soldier trying to put his life back together. This was a man who had fought, really fought, and who had come out on the other side, scarred but stronger. "So why didn't you say anything before?" Nia asked, her voice softer now. "Why keep it all bottled up?" Dr. Westbrook sighed, his shoulders sagging as if the burden of his past had suddenly grown heavier. "Because I didn't want to be that person anymore. I didn't want to be the guy who was always looking over his shoulder, always expecting a fight. I wanted to build something different here, something normal." He glanced around the clinic, his eyes lingering on the walls that had seen so many patients over the years. "I wanted to be a healer, not a soldier." Nia took a step closer to him, her voice gentle. "But that doesn't mean you have to forget who you are, Ethan. We need you. This place needs you. You can't fight this battle alone." He looked at her, a flicker of something passing through his eyes. "I don't plan on fighting alone," he said, his voice firm. "But I also don't plan on backing down. Not this time." The sound of a door opening interrupted the moment, and EZ walked into the room, his expression grim. He had been watching from the sidelines, but now it was clear that he was ready to take action. "You're right," he said, his voice low. "They're not done, and neither are we. The Syndicate isn't going to stop until they have gotten what they want." Dr. Westbrook looked at EZ, his expression hardening. "Then we make sure they don't get it, whatever it takes." The clinic was still. The morning light had shifted into the harsh brightness of afternoon, casting long shadows across the floors. Dr. Westbrook's eyes were sharp, focused on the broken window in the waiting room, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The fight was over for now, but he could feel the weight of what was coming next. The Raven Syndicate wasn't the type to let a loss slide. They would regroup, lick their wounds, and come back with a vengeance. Izzet had been pacing by the front door for the better part of the morning, his posture tense, his eyes never staying still. He had been a part of the Syndicate once, one of the men they trusted, one of their muscle, but he had walked away years ago, choosing a different path. Still, it seemed the old life wasn't ready to let him go. Every move he made, every step he took now, felt like it was an echo of his past. "They'll be back," EZ said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the street outside. "They're not done. They won't forget what happened here." Dr. Westbrook didn't reply immediately. He was busy organizing the supplies that had been scattered across the floor during the fight. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind was far from the task at hand. He could feel it, the tension hanging in the air, thick with anticipation. The Syndicate wouldn't let this go. They would come back stronger. Nia was in the back, checking on the few patients who remained. The clinic was quiet for now, the usual hum of activity replaced with an uneasy stillness. Patients had stopped coming in, some out of fear, others out of uncertainty. The fight had scared them, and the rumors of the Syndicate's threats were only adding to their hesitation. But Dr. Westbrook couldn't afford to let fear take hold. He had made a promise to this community, and he wasn't about to break it. He had been through worse, much worse, and he wasn't going to back down now. The door creaked open, and Nia stepped out from the back room, her eyes scanning the clinic as if she could feel the same weight he did. She stopped next to him, arms crossed. "We can't keep doing this, Ethan," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of frustration. "If they come back—" "They will," he interrupted, his voice low but certain. He knew the Syndicate too well. He had seen their tactics. They didn't give up, not unless they got what they wanted. Nia exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand across her forehead. "We can't just keep fighting them off. We're not prepared for what's coming next. We're not even armed. And they—" She paused, her voice faltering for a moment. "They won't stop until we're gone. Or worse." Dr. Westbrook's eyes softened, but his resolve didn't waver. "I know what's at stake, but we're not backing down." Just then, the sound of engines rumbled down the street, their deep growl unmistakable. EZ was the first to react, his body tensing, his eyes narrowing as he moved toward the window. "They're here," he muttered, his voice heavy with familiarity. Dr. Westbrook and Nia exchanged a glance. The Syndicate had returned, and this time, they weren't just sending in a handful of men. They were coming for something bigger, something more dangerous. EZ moved toward the door, ready for whatever was about to come. But Dr. Westbrook grabbed his arm before he could leave. holding him back for a moment. "Stay close. We've got this. Together." EZ nodded once, his face set in grim determination. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Doc." The clinic had never looked more vulnerable. The boards on the windows, the broken glass that still lay on the floor from the previous fight, all of it was a stark reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. Dr. Westbrook stood by the counter, his hands clenched, his eyes scanning every possible exit and every potential danger. He wasn't going to let this place fall. Not today, not ever. Outside, the sound of engines grew louder. Several vehicles pulled up in front of the clinic, their tires screeching to a halt. A black SUV parked directly in front of the clinic, followed by two smaller cars. The doors slammed open and figures spilled out, rough, mean, and clearly not here for a friendly chat. Nia and Dr. Westbrook exchanged one final look. There was no more time for talking. The syndicate was here, and this time, they weren't looking for a negotiation. Rico stepped out of the SUV first, his towering figure filling the doorway of the clinic as he looked around, surveying the damage. His men flanked him, their eyes cold and calculating, each of them moving with the kind of coordinated ease that only comes from working with people you trust. "I thought we made ourselves clear." Rico's voice was low but carried through the room like a blade, cutting the air. His eyes scanned the space, taking in the broken windows and the damage. "This is our neighborhood. You either follow our rules or you get burned." Dr. Westbrook stood his ground, his eyes never leaving Rico's. "You already tried to take something from me," he said calmly, "and I'm not about to let you take anything else." Rico chuckled, the sound dark and mocking. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't just about taking something from you. This is about showing you who's in charge." He stepped forward, his face only inches away from Dr. Westbrook's. "And you don't have what it takes to stop me." But before Dr. Westbrook could respond, the door swung open, and a fresh set of footsteps echoed down the hall. EZ had positioned himself near the back exit, his eyes locked on the group of men outside. He knew that their best chance of survival now was to stand strong, to hold their ground. Rico's eyes flicked to EZ, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "So the prodigal son returns," he said with a mocking tone. "Didn't think you'd come back, E. Guess you missed the family." EZ didn't flinch. He wasn't a part of the syndicate anymore. That life was behind him. "I'm not your family, Rico," he said, his voice flat. "I'm here for the people who need help, not for whatever twisted game you're playing." Rico's smirk faded, his patience thinning. "Get out of our way, E. We've got work to do." But Dr. Westbrook wasn't backing down. He stepped forward, his eyes steady, his jaw set. "You've caused enough damage. If you want to finish this, then let's finish it." The tension in the room was palpable. Rico's men shifted, weapons in hand, ready for the next move. But Dr. Westbrook had already made his. "This ends now," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but the weight of his words hung in the air. Nia moved toward the counter, her hand resting on the drawer where a few emergency tools were hidden. Tools they would need if it came to a fight. EZ moved silently, positioning himself in the shadows, ready for whatever came next. Dr. Westbrook didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He was prepared. The Raven Syndicate had no idea what they had just walked into. The clinic had transformed. It was no longer just a small medical facility. It had become a battleground. The front door was reinforced with metal brackets, the windows boarded up tighter than before, leaving only narrow slits for visibility. The sound of distant traffic on the streets outside was muted, the usual hum of life replaced by an unsettling quiet. Inside, tension crackled in the air like static before a storm. Dr. Westbrook stood by the reception desk, his posture rigid, eyes never leaving the door. He had been through this kind of violence before. War zones, street battles, insurgencies. But this was different. This was his clinic, his patients, his home, and he wasn't going to let it be taken from him. EZ stood in the back, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the shadows for any movement. His past with the Raven Syndicate weighed on him, but this wasn't the time for hesitation. He had walked away from the life of violence, but that didn't mean the violence hadn't followed him, and today it would have to be faced. Nia moved silently around the clinic, collecting any remaining medical supplies, the tools of healing. If this was going to turn into a full-on war, they needed to be prepared for anything. And right now she could feel it in her bones. Something bad was coming. The doorbell jingled softly as the clinic's front door opened. The sound, so ordinary under normal circumstances, now felt like an alarm, signaling the approach of something dangerous. Dr. Westbrook's heart rate picked up slightly, but he kept his face neutral. Rico and his crew had already been here once, but this time, they weren't playing games. This time, they were coming with everything they had. The footsteps outside grew louder, the unmistakable sound of heavy boots pounding against the pavement. Dr. Westbrook's eyes shifted toward the door. He knew what this meant. The syndicate was back, and they were bringing reinforcements. "Here they come," EZ muttered under his breath, his voice steady but filled with the kind of quiet anticipation that only came from someone who had been on the receiving end of too many fights. Dr. Westbrook didn't respond. His mind was focused. Every muscle in his body trained for what was about to happen. His eyes scanned the room, locking on to the narrow exits, the shadows, the potential threats. There would be no mistakes today. The door swung open with a force that rattled the frame, and in they came. Rico, flanked by his men, all of them armed, their faces set with the kind of grim determination that only comes from knowing you're about to take what you want by force. Rico's eyes scanned the clinic, a smug grin spreading across his face as he saw the barricades and the hastily boarded up windows. It didn't faze him. He had seen worse. He had made worse. "You still haven't learned, have you, Doc?" Rico said, his voice smooth and taunting. "You think this little clinic is going to stop us? We're just getting started." Dr. Westbrook didn't flinch. "You've already taken enough," he said, his voice low and steady. "But it's not going to happen again?" Rico's smile faltered for just a moment, the edge in Dr. Westbrook's tone registering, but he quickly recovered. He wasn't going to back down now. "Let's make this simple, Doc," Rico said, stepping forward. "You either hand over what we want or we take it by force. No more negotiations, no more waiting." But Dr. Westbrook was done with the waiting, done with the intimidation. The syndicate had come into his clinic, threatened his staff, and tried to take what wasn't theirs. And now they were going to pay the price. "I'm not giving you anything," Dr. Westbrook said, his voice unwavering. "You'll get nothing from me, and you're not walking out of here like you did last time." Rico's face hardened. He had expected resistance, but something in Dr. Westbrook's calmness unnerved him. He gestured to his men, signaling them to spread out. They didn't need to rush. They were in control, or so they thought. As the syndicate's men moved, Dr. Westbrook's body coiled like a spring, his eyes never leaving the nearest threat. He knew they were making their move, but he was already one step ahead. He could feel the familiar pulse of adrenaline in his veins, the same feeling he'd had on the front lines, the same feeling he'd had when lives were on the line. In a flash, the first man lunged forward, gun raised, but Dr. Westbrook was already moving. He ducked, sidestepping the blow with the kind of speed that was almost impossible to predict. A quick strike to the man's wrist sent the gun flying, and before the man could recover, Dr. Westbrook had him pinned to the ground, immobilized with a swift series of moves that left him unconscious in seconds. "First mistake," Dr. Westbrook muttered, wiping his hands on his coat. The next man moved in, but EZ was already there. He grabbed the man by the shoulders, spinning him around and slamming him into the wall with a force that made the clinic shake. The man grunted in pain, but EZ wasn't finished. A swift knee to the stomach left him gasping for breath, and a punch to the jaw sent him crumpling to the floor. Rico's face twisted in fury as he saw two of his men taken down so easily. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This was supposed to be his victory. He had underestimated Dr. Westbrook, and now it was clear that his crew wasn't going to walk away unscathed. "Kill him," Rico spat, his voice low and venomous. "Do whatever it takes. Take the damn clinic if you have to." The remaining men surged forward, but Dr. Westbrook was ready. He moved like a shadow, striking with precision, every hit calculated to disarm and incapacitate, not kill. They were no longer just criminals. They were threats to his life, to his clinic, and to the people he had sworn to protect. and he wasn't about to let that go unchallenged. Another man lunged at him with a knife, but Dr. Westbrook was already stepping aside, his hand coming up to grab the wrist, twisting it so hard that the knife fell to the ground. A quick elbow to the man's face sent him reeling, his nose shattering under the force of the blow. EZ was moving too, taking on the last remaining member of Rico's crew, his fists a blur as he delivered rapid, brutal punches that left the man stumbling, trying to shield himself. But EZ was relentless, not giving him a chance to recover. Rico watched in disbelief as his men were taken down, one by one. The clinic had become a war zone, and the Raven Syndicate was losing. They weren't the predators now, they were the prey. "You think this is over?" Rico hissed, taking a step back. His crew was decimated, and his pride was bruised. He had come here expecting to crush Dr. Westbrook, but now he was looking at the wreckage of his own plan. Dr. Westbrook's gaze was cold. "It's just beginning." And with that, Rico turned and bolted for the door, leaving behind his fallen men and his pride. The battle was over for now, but the war was far from finished. The clinic was quiet again, save for the sound of heavy breathing. Dr. Westbrook stood, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his hands still steady despite the violence that had just unfolded. He wasn't sure how long he could keep this up. The Raven Syndicate would regroup. They would come again. But this time, they wouldn't be taking him by surprise. The clinic was eerily quiet after the fight. The distant rumble of traffic outside was all that broke the heavy silence that had descended upon the room. Dr. Westbrook stood near the reception desk, his hands resting on the counter as he surveyed the damage. Chairs were overturned, glass was shattered from the broken windows, and the walls were scarred from the impact of gunfire. But despite the wreckage, the clinic was still standing. It had withstood the storm, for now anyway. Nia moved through the wreckage, collecting medical supplies and making sure nothing had been damaged beyond repair. She had known this day would come. She had seen enough to understand that when the Raven Syndicate set their sights on something, they didn't back down easily. But what had just happened, what they had just survived, was beyond anything she had imagined. They had fought back, and they had won. For now. Dr. Westbrook's eyes were distant as he watched Nia work, his thoughts lingering on what had just transpired. The fight had been brutal, but it hadn't been the worst of it. It was the aftermath that weighed on him. The Syndicate had tasted defeat, and when men like Rico tasted defeat, they didn't let it slide. They came back harder, stronger. "Are we ready for this?" Nia asked, breaking into his thoughts. She was standing near the back door, her fingers tightening around a set of keys. She looked exhausted, her face drawn with worry. "Because I don't think this ends here." Dr. Westbrook met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "It doesn't end here, but we'll be ready." "Are you sure about that?" she asked, a note of frustration creeping into her voice. "Because every time they come back, it gets worse. We can't keep doing this. We can't just keep fighting." He understood her frustration. He felt it too. But there was no other choice. The Raven Syndicate didn't leave people alone once they had been crossed, and he wasn't about to let them take everything he had worked for, everything he had built. "We'll deal with whatever comes next, together." His voice was steady, reassuring, but the weight of it, the weight of the war they had just started, hung in the air between them. Nia didn't say anything for a long moment. She simply nodded, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. She didn't find it, but there was something else in his gaze, something that worried her. Before she could respond, the front door swung open again, and EZ stepped inside. He looked different now, more serious, more focused. His face was drawn, but there was something in his eyes that told Dr. Westbrook everything he needed to know. The fight had taken something out of him, but it hadn't broken him. Not yet. "They'll be back," EZ said, his voice grim. "And they won't just be coming for supplies this time. They're coming for blood." Dr. Westbrook nodded, his jaw tightening at the words. He had known that. He had expected it, and it terrified him. But there was no turning back now. The Ravens had made their move, and he had no choice but to respond. "Then we'll be ready, Doctor," Westbrook said again, more to himself than to anyone else. He had no choice. No one else was going to protect this clinic. No one else was going to protect these people. Nia looked at him, her expression softening for a moment. We can't fight this fight alone, Ethan. We need to get help. We need more people on our side. EZ gave a low laugh. Help? From who? The cops? They're too scared to even come near this place. We can't count on them. No, Nia said firmly, shaking her head. Not the cops, but we've got allies in this neighborhood. People who owe you, people who trust you. She turned to Dr. Westbrook, her gaze filled with determination. If we're going to survive this, we need to fight back with more than just the three of us. Dr. Westbrook met her gaze, the weight of her words settling on him. He knew she was right. He couldn't do this alone. He had spent too many years isolated, fighting his own battles, trying to keep the clinic afloat. But now the world was closing in. He needed to rely on others. He needed to build a resistance, a force strong enough to take on the syndicate. I'll reach out to them, he said quietly. The people who've trusted me. We need to make sure we've got enough to fight back, and we need to make sure we've got a plan. EZ raised an eyebrow. You think they'll join us? After what just happened? They don't have a choice, Dr. Westbrook replied, his voice cold. The syndicate is coming for everyone in this neighborhood. If they don't stand with us, they'll stand against us. Nia nodded, but there was a quiet concern in her eyes. It's not going to be easy, Ethan. This isn't just about protecting the clinic anymore. This is about protecting everyone who lives here. People's lives are on the line. Dr. Westbrook glanced around the clinic, his eyes taking in the damage, the broken windows, the torn furniture, the remnants of the fight. Everything was a reminder of what was at stake. This place has always been more than just a clinic, he said softly. It's been a sanctuary for these people. It's where they come when there's nowhere else to turn. And I'm not going to let the syndicate destroy that. He turned to face EZ, his expression hardening. We're going to need more than just allies, though. We're going to need strategy. We're going to need weapons. We need to be ready for what's coming. EZ nodded, his gaze steady. I've got some contacts, people who owe me from back when I was with them. I'll reach out. Dr. Westbrook's eyes softened for a moment as he looked at his two allies, standing there with him. Nia, the fierce nurse who had been by his side since day one. EZ, the ex-syndicate enforcer turned ally. They had all come from different walks of life, but now they were bound by a common cause. They were in this together. But even as they stood there, ready to plan and prepare, they knew the truth. The calm would not last long. The Raven Syndicate had tasted defeat, and they would not stop until they had their revenge. And when they came again, this time, it would be for more than just a fight. It would be for everything. The day after the battle was quiet, but the calm was deceptive. Dr. Westbrook stood by the window of the clinic, his eyes scanning the street, his mind far from the task at hand. He hadn't been able to sleep much. The adrenaline from the fight still buzzed in his body, and even now, as the day stretched on, he could feel the weight of what was to come. The Raven Syndicate would return. They wouldn't let things go. They would come for him, for the clinic, and for the people who had dared to stand against them. He had sent word out. He had reached out to the people who had come through his clinic over the years, those who had trusted him with their health, their lives. The neighborhood had always been fractured, divided, but there was a shared respect for what the clinic had done for them. Now Dr. Westbrook was counting on that respect to turn into something more. He needed allies. He needed people who would fight back. Nia had spent most of the morning preparing the clinic, organizing the supplies, making sure everything was ready. She was doing what she could to keep the place running, but her mind was just as much on the battle that was brewing outside these walls. They had to prepare, but preparing for what? The syndicate was a well-oiled machine, ruthless and violent. What chance did they have? Dr. Westbrook knew the answer to that. They didn't have a choice. If they didn't fight, they would lose everything. The clinic, the people who trusted them, the community. The syndicate had already taken too much, and if he didn't stop them now, they would keep coming until there was nothing left. EZ entered the clinic from the back, his expression grim, his eyes scanning the room. He had spent the morning making calls, reaching out to his old contacts. Some were still tied to the syndicate. Others had fallen out of favor with them over the years. but none of them were in the position to take on the full force of the syndicate. Still, EZ was resourceful, and even if they couldn't win with numbers, they could win with tactics. "They're out there," EZ said quietly, his voice low, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "I've heard whispers. The word's out that we've crossed them, and they're making plans. I don't know how long we've got, but it won't be long." Dr. Westbrook turned to face him, his brow furrowing. "How long? Could be days, could be hours. They're not going to waste time coming after us. They'll hit hard and fast, take us down before we can even respond." Nia, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been thinking about this all morning. "We can't just wait for them to show up. We need to get ahead of them. We need to get the people on our side, not just hide behind these walls." Dr. Westbrook looked at her, his gaze meeting hers, understanding the fear that lay beneath her words. She was right. He had been so focused on preparing for the fight, so fixated on the threat that was coming, that he hadn't stopped to consider how they were going to fight back. "We need to bring the community together," Dr. Westbrook said finally, his voice steady. "If we don't stand together, we'll fall alone. It's not just about us anymore. It's about everyone in this neighborhood. And if we want to stop them, we need to show them that we're not afraid." EZ nodded. "That's the only way we stand a chance. We rally the people, get them to fight with us. We're not just taking on a few thugs, we're taking on a whole empire." Dr. Westbrook stepped away from the window and walked toward the back door of the clinic. He had a few key people he needed to see. People who had been loyal to him for years, people who knew how to fight and who weren't afraid of the syndicate. He couldn't do this alone. "We'll go to them," Dr. Westbrook said, his tone unwavering. "We need to talk to the business owners, the shopkeepers, the ones who have been paying protection money, the ones who are too afraid to stand up. We need to show them what's at stake, and we need to give them a reason to fight." Nia raised an eyebrow. "You think they'll help us?" "I don't think we have much choice," Dr. Westbrook replied. "They either stand with us or they'll be next. The syndicate doesn't care who you are, what you do, or how much money you've got. If they want something, they take it. And if we don't stop them, they'll keep coming." The air in the clinic was thick with anticipation as Dr. Westbrook made the decision that would shape everything to come. He was going to fight back. He was going to take the fight to the syndicate. He was going to take back his clinic, his neighborhood, and the people who had trusted him. But the stakes were higher now. If he failed, the clinic would be destroyed. And worse, so would everyone who depended on it. As Dr. Westbrook prepared to leave, he turned to EZ. "Stay here, keep an eye on the clinic. If anyone comes, you let me know immediately." EZ nodded, his jaw tightening. "I won't let them get to you, Doc." The two of them exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. They had been through too much together, seen too many things, to not know how this was going to end. They could only control what was within their reach, and right now that meant getting the community to rally behind them. The streets were quieter than usual as Dr. Westbrook stepped outside, the sun casting long shadows on the pavement. He moved swiftly, his mind racing through the names of the people he needed to talk to, the ones who could help. There was no time to waste. Every second mattered. As he walked, he saw faces he knew, familiar faces from the clinic, from the neighborhood. He nodded at them, but there was no time for pleasantries. This wasn't a casual visit. This was a call to arms. They needed to come together. They needed to be prepared. Dr. Westbrook approached the first business owner he needed to see, a man named Marcus, who ran a local convenience store. Marcus had been hit by the syndicate's extortion, but he had always been too afraid to do anything about it. He had paid his dues, kept his head down, and hoped that they would leave him alone. But now, as Dr. Westbrook stepped up to his store, he knew Marcus's choice had been made for him. "We need your help," Dr. Westbrook said firmly as he walked into Marcus's shop. "The syndicate's coming for all of us, and we can't fight them alone." Marcus didn't speak immediately. His eyes flickered to the door, as if expecting someone to walk in behind Dr. Westbrook, but there was no one, just the two of them. "I'm done hiding," Marcus said quietly, his voice heavy with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I'm with you, Doc." The foundation had been laid. Now it was time to build the resistance. The sun had barely set, casting an orange glow over the city, when Dr. Westbrook made his rounds, meeting with the business owners, storekeepers, and the people who had once been too afraid to stand against the Raven Syndicate. There was no time to waste. Every minute was precious, and the weight of the responsibility pressed down on him like never before. He had spoken to Marcus, and now the plan was taking shape. Slowly but surely, the pieces were coming together. Some were hesitant, too scared to believe that a fight was possible. But for the first time, Dr. Westbrook saw the spark of something in their eyes. Fear was still there, but so was something else. Defiance. And that was all he needed to see. As he walked down the street to meet more of the people who might join them, the night air felt thick with anticipation. He didn't know how much time they had left before the syndicate struck again, but he knew that they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The clinic had never been just a place of healing. It had been a sanctuary, and now it was a rallying point, a symbol of resistance. But a symbol wasn't enough. They needed to be more than that. They needed to act. Dr. Westbrook reached the next stop on his list, Lena's Diner, the heart of the block. It wasn't much, a small place with cracked booths and faded menus, but it was a gathering spot. People trusted Lena, and Lena trusted him. Her diner had always been the place where the neighborhood came together, and today it would become more than just a diner. It would become a base of operations. Lena looked up from the counter as he stepped inside. Her brow furrowed and her lips tightened with concern. "You really think this is the way to handle it?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron as she walked over to him. "We don't have a choice, Lena," Dr. Westbrook replied, his voice firm but quiet. "The syndicate's coming, and if we don't fight back now, they'll take everything." Lena studied him for a moment, then glanced out the window, her gaze scanning the street. "I've heard the rumors," she said quietly. "They're coming for all of us, aren't they?" Dr. Westbrook nodded. "Yes, and we're not going to let them. Not this time." Lena stood there for a moment, her hands resting on the counter. Then she exhaled slowly and met his gaze. "All right, I'll help. We'll get the word out. The others, some of them might not be ready, but there's enough of us. We can't let them take over." "Thank you," Dr. Westbrook said, his voice quiet but sincere. "We need all the help we can get. They won't stop until they get what they want, but we have something they don't. Our community." Lena's eyes softened. "You're right. Let's get ready. But we'll need more than just words. We need a plan. We need to be prepared for them." Dr. Westbrook nodded, a grim smile crossing his face. "We'll be ready. I'm working on it." The next few hours passed quickly as Dr. Westbrook, Lena, and the others began to prepare. Word spread fast, and soon a small army of residents and business owners gathered at the diner. Some came out of fear, others out of loyalty, but most came because they saw the clinic as something worth saving, something that represented the heart of their community. EZ had spent the day gathering supplies, using his old connections to secure whatever they could get their hands on. Flashlights, makeshift weapons, tools for barricading the doors. It wasn't much, but it was something. Nia had been working just as tirelessly, organizing what was left of their medical supplies and preparing for the worst-case scenario. By the time the sun had fully set, the diner had become their central command. The room was filled with the hum of anxious voices and the rustle of plans being made. Everyone knew what was coming. The syndicate was going to hit them hard, and they had to be ready. Dr. Westbrook stood at the front of the diner, looking over the faces gathered around the table. These were his people now, his responsibility. The faces before him were a mixture of fear, anger, and determination. They were scared, yes, but there was also something else in their eyes: resolve. They had no choice but to stand together. "We don't have a lot of time," Dr. Westbrook said, his voice cutting through the noise of the room. "The syndicate won't give us a second chance. If we're going to stand a chance, we need to work together. We need to be smart, and we need to be ready." Lena stepped forward. "We've got eyes on the street," she said, her voice low and steady. "People who've seen the cars coming in and out of the neighborhood. They're gearing up for something big." Dr. Westbrook nodded. "We'll need to act fast. We can't afford to let them corner us. We need to hit them where it hurts." Nia spoke up from the back, her voice sharp with urgency. "The clinic's been hit already. They'll come back. We need to be ready for whatever they throw at us." "We'll protect the clinic," Dr. Westbrook said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "But we need to make sure they don't get any more leverage. We'll set up barricades in the alleyways, monitor the exits, keep them from getting in unnoticed." EZ had returned with a group of volunteers, some armed with whatever they had on hand, tools, bats, even pipes. "We're not an army," he said, "but we're not helpless either." Dr. Westbrook looked at him, his eyes hardening. "It's not about being an army, it's about holding the line. We fight smart. We fight together." The tension in the room thickened as the volunteers set to work, preparing the diner and the surrounding buildings. Dr. Westbrook's mind raced through the plan, refining it as they went. He knew they didn't have the numbers, the firepower, or the experience of the Syndicate, but they had something better: each other. As the night deepened and preparations continued, Dr. Westbrook couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was coming sooner than they expected. The Syndicate had a way of striking when people least expected it, but they were ready now. They had no choice. "This is it," Dr. Westbrook said to EZ as they checked the last barricades. "This is what we've been preparing for." EZ nodded, his eyes steely. "I'll make sure the streets stay clear. No one gets through unless we say so." The calm before the storm had passed. Now there was nothing left but to face what was coming. The streets were silent. The usual hum of city life had faded into a tense quiet that hung heavily in the air. The preparations were complete. Dr. Westbrook stood outside the diner, his eyes scanning the surroundings. His breath was steady, but inside his pulse was a constant drumbeat of anticipation. He could feel it. The final confrontation was closing in, the weight of the Syndicate's imminent arrival pressing on the neighborhood like a storm cloud. The barricades were set, the volunteers were in position, the community had come together, rallied behind a cause larger than any of them. But Dr. Westbrook knew that the fight wouldn't be won by numbers alone. It was going to take everything they had: their courage, their resolve, their ability to outthink and outlast the Syndicate. In the distance, the sound of engines revving pierced the quiet, growing louder with each passing second. It was the unmistakable sound of approaching vehicles, a familiar signal that the Syndicate was coming. Dr. Westbrook's stomach twisted with a mixture of fear and determination. This was it. There was no turning back now. "They're here," EZ said, stepping out from the shadows near the alleyway. His eyes were cold, his body taut with the same readiness that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. "Looks like they brought the whole damn crew." Dr. Westbrook nodded. "We can't let them in. We can't let them take this place." Nia stepped forward, her face set with fierce resolve. "We don't just protect the clinic, Ethan. We protect this whole neighborhood, the people who have nowhere else to go. We fight for them, for the ones who trusted us." He met her gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something greater, a community, a place where people could heal, a place that had already been through so much and refused to bend to fear. The first vehicle came into view, a black SUV, the unmistakable symbol of the Raven Syndicate. It slowed as it approached the corner, its headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the faces of the men inside. Dr. Westbrook knew them all by sight: Rico, of course, and his crew, the men who had thought they could terrorize the neighborhood into submission. But tonight that wouldn't happen. Dr. Westbrook signaled to EZ, who moved swiftly to his post. The plan was set. They knew what they had to do. They just had to hold their ground. The SUV came to a stop in front of the diner, the engine growling to a halt. The headlights blazed for a moment before they dimmed, casting long shadows across the street. Rico stepped out first, his hands in his jacket pockets, his usual smirk nowhere to be found. His crew followed, weapons drawn, faces twisted in anger. "Last chance, Doc," Rico called out, his voice cold and calculating. "You really think this neighborhood's going to protect you? You really think these people are going to fight with you? You're all dead already." Dr. Westbrook stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Rico's. There was no fear in his gaze, only resolve. "You're wrong, Rico," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't about us anymore. This is about everyone you've tried to break. This is about every person who's ever come through this door, looking for help, and you're not taking any of it." The tension in the air was palpable. thick with the weight of everything that had led them to this moment. The silence hung between them like a loaded gun, waiting for the first shot to be fired. Rico laughed, but it was hollow, tinged with frustration. "You really think you've got what it takes to stand up to me?" he asked, his hand moving slowly to the weapon at his side. "You're going to regret this." But before he could make his move, a sharp crack rang out in the night. One of the syndicate men fell to the ground, a dart embedded in his neck. The others froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the shot, high above, from the rooftop of a nearby building. EZ was the first to move. He was already in position, his crossbow still raised from the first shot. The syndicate had been caught off guard, but it wouldn't last long. Dr. Westbrook's plan had worked. The distraction had created the opening they needed. "Now!" Dr. Westbrook shouted, and the volunteers who had been waiting in the shadows sprang into action. The barricades were breached, but not by the syndicate. Instead, they were taken down by the people who had come together to fight. A second wave of defenders surged forward from the alley, armed with whatever they could find: pipes, bats, crowbars. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't perfect, but it was a fight. And for the first time in a long while, the syndicate didn't have the upper hand. Rico's men scrambled, trying to regroup, but it was too late. Dr. Westbrook had already anticipated their next move, and the syndicate was pushed back with force. The clinic had become more than just a medical facility. It had become the front line of a battle that would change everything. The fight raged on, gunshots, shouts, and the sound of bodies colliding filled the air. But Dr. Westbrook moved with purpose, directing the volunteers, helping those who needed medical attention, coordinating with Nia and EZ, who had already taken positions to keep the syndicate on the defensive. Rico was furious. He was used to winning, used to controlling the streets, but this was different. They weren't rolling over. They weren't afraid. And that was something he couldn't handle. In the midst of the chaos, Dr. Westbrook found himself face to face with Rico. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. It wasn't just the clinic at stake anymore. It was everything Dr. Westbrook had built: a life, a community, a purpose, and he wasn't going to lose it. "You're done, Rico," Dr. Westbrook said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with the weight of his resolve. Rico lunged forward, but Dr. Westbrook was ready. A swift strike to the stomach knocked the air out of him, and before he could react, Dr. Westbrook had him pinned to the ground, his knee pressed into Rico's chest. "Don't come back," Dr. Westbrook muttered, his voice low but certain. "This is over." As Rico gasped for air, unable to move, Dr. Westbrook stood up, looking around at the others. Some were injured, others were still standing, resolute. The battle wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned. The syndicate had underestimated them, and now they were paying the price. As the last of the syndicate's men were rounded up, the clinic stood victorious, battered but unbroken. The people had fought back, and for the first time, they had won. The clinic was quiet again, the aftermath of the battle settling into the streets. The air felt different now, lighter. The neighborhood was still standing, still intact. And for the first time, Dr. Westbrook allowed himself to breathe, to let the tension ease from his shoulders. Nia and EZ were both at his side, their faces worn but proud. They had done it, together. "We made it," Nia said, a tired smile on her face. Dr. Westbrook nodded. "For now, but we're not done yet." There would be more challenges, more fights ahead. But tonight, they had proven something to themselves and to everyone who had stood with them. They were stronger than the syndicate, and they always would be.